Hi folks, Lou here to talk about why wars end, and that's why, not how. So there's a lot of talk about negotiations in the Russo-Ukraine war right now, and that's what made me think of this. Even though the demands of the two parties are so far apart, no negotiation can succeed, but modern diplomats think a ceasefire is all that matters. And sometimes that's not true. So negotiation does usually occur at the end of a war, even in the end of World War II when the Germans negotiated their surrender and the Japanese negotiated their surrender. But that's not the real reason why the war ended. And keep in mind, I'm generalizing to a few reasons, so it's likely there are going to be a few things that I miss. So here's a list. I have 6 here, but at the end I reduce it to really to 3, as you'll see. Now, a typical end to a war is both sides decide that bargaining is better than fighting. And that's been typical in most eras of history. Both sides may start fighting for various reasons. Neither side meets all their objectives. Neither side sees continuing to fight as worth the cost, so they negotiate an end to the war. Now, for example, the Roman Republic tended not to do this when the other side expected them to. And that's one reason why Rome succeeded. In the First Punic War, for example, which lasted 20-some years, the Romans were prostrate, the Carthaginians were prostrate, but Roman citizens raised enough money to build another fleet, and the Romans won the war. And in the Second Punic War, the Hannibal War, the war went on for more than 20 years, but in the end the Romans prevailed because they refused to lose, in effect, and they had resources to not lose. But that's an exception to the norm. Of course, another reason can be a death or in some other way a change in leadership. Imagine if Hitler had died in 1942. How would that have affected the war? Would it have continued to full conquest? I doubt it immensely. What if Abraham Lincoln had not been reelected during the American Civil War in 1864? That probably would have ended quite differently. What if Vladimir Putin suddenly dies? Well, maybe someone else will take over and try to pursue the same results. But at this point, the Russians are doing so poorly, the Russian economy is failing, that it's likely that whoever succeeded Putin would have to take a different course. In general, a war party can be replaced by a peace party in government. And of course, in the case of monarchies, if a king dies, the successor may be of a different mind. For example, in Russia, at one point in the 7 Years' War, the Tsar was replaced by another Tsar, and that Tsar admired Frederick the Great and took the Russian pressure off, and Frederick and his country survived. Of course, the people can also force a change, but that doesn't happen often. Another way that a war ends is one side meets its objectives and the other has failed to respond successfully. For example, the Spanish-American War. The Spanish had no hope of regaining Cuba or regaining the Philippines or their other possessions. The only thing they could look forward to is getting raided by the American Navy if they kept on. And the Americans had done what they wanted to do. So they negotiated a peace and the war was done. And this includes many wars of larger powers over smaller ones. For example, the first American-Iraq War. Another thing that can happen is that there's military success or failure by one side, so that the other side, in effect, is going to win the war. This is a form of meeting objectives. For example, the Franco-Prussian War, 1870-71. The Germans could have conquered France, but that wasn't their objective. And the rest of Europe would probably have objected to conquest of France and done something about it. Now, in World War II, the Germans did conquer France, but their real objectives were to the east, Lebensraum, not the west. They fought the west because they had to, not because they wanted to. They wanted to go through Poland and Russia, and that was that. Another reason for a war to end, a quite common one, is the exhaustion of both sides, which is an extreme form of bargaining is better than fighting. Now, if only one side is exhausted, the other usually negotiates the loss rather than give up entirely. If both are exhausted, they negotiate a stalemate, as in the Korean War, which ended with an armistice and officially has not ended today. In the Vietnam War, the North Vietnamese and their allies outlasted the Americans and their allies. Ancient wars might run many years, longer than modern wars generally, because warfare was unlikely to exhaust the country. It was sort of something that was done by the rulers and by sometimes mercenaries, and not the people as a whole. Now, subjugation or conquest, despite the results of World War II, are rare. Even in World War I, Germany was more or less intact when they agreed to an armistice. The Ottoman Empire lived on, diminished as Turkey. Kemal Ataturk, who's known as the father of his country, the father of Turkey, was an Ottoman military officer during World War I. Austro-Hungary was divided into several states, but it was not subjugated. Another subjugation we can think of is the Second American War in Iraq, which resulted in the death of Saddam Hussein, and Americans are still there, but it's not a subjugation at this point. Keep in mind, it's hard to conquer an entire country and expensive to hold it. And that's barring expanding empires such as the Third Reich, Hitler's Germany, or contemporary Russia. Most countries don't desire complete conquest or subjugation. Rome didn't occupy the city of Carthage in the Second Punic War, although they took away the Carthaginian Empire. Rome is a peculiar case where it kind of stumbled into empire. It didn't necessarily want to conquer all the places that it ended up controlling, but it happened anyway. Sparta didn't occupy Athens when they won the Peloponnesian War. On the other hand, yes, the Persians wanted to occupy Greece, or at least completely subjugate it, but that didn't work out. Perhaps we could say it's the empires that are most interested in conquest or subjugation. So as I've explained these ways of ending, I realize they're all part and parcel of kind of the same thing, really. Neither side meets their objectives, and at some point it's cheaper to settle than to keep fighting. Or one meets its objectives, the other cannot stop them, so they negotiate to end the war. It's most unlikely that both achieve their objectives. But then, if they did so, why wouldn't they end with negotiation? Because they've done what they needed to do. And I have a separate video about why wars get started. Thanks for listening.